Gary Gasparino. Present. Stephen Herlock.
Present.
Daniel Murphy.
Present.
Mike Stubblefield.
Present.
Before I get into the petition number, those that are in the audience that would be addressing the board, you'll be under oath, so I would appreciate you please rising so the clerk can administer the oath.
Please raise your right hand. Do you and each of you do solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give in the matters now pending before this board will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you very much. For the record, please note that we do have a quorum. Today we're going to be hearing petition number 834. It's a petition of Vintage Production California, LLC, for a short variance. And this variance is from District Rule 29.C, Conditions on Permits, violation of Federal Operating Permit number 00004. The attachment is 71.1N1, Condition 1, and District Rule 71.1, which is dealing with crude oil production and separation under sections B1 and C1, requirements for storage tanks and produced gas. By the way, I wanted to ask, were anybody from the public wishing to address the board on this matter? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we had the swearing in. I guess I should ask, is there anything else that needs to be added to the agenda? No. Okay, fine. For purposes, the next hearing board meeting, please add the nomination and the selection of the new chair. Thank you. Okay. At this point in time, I'd like to ask the petitioner to address the board, to state your name and your position, and at that time you can address the board. Yes, you're welcome to come to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, county council, district staff. My name is James Lovins. I am Senior Environmental Advisor for Vintage Production California, LLC, and here to present just a brief summary of the facts in our petition tonight. Basically, we're requesting a short variance from the rules that Chairman Gasparino discussed in order to allow us to test the integrity of a 6-inch gas line that runs from the top of Silvercrest and Upper Ojai down to the 12th Street Bridge. This gas line runs down basically Sulphur Mountain, connects to Highway 150, runs down the middle of Highway 150 down to the jog onto 11th Street, turns down Santa Paula Avenue, and then continues down 12th Street to the 12th Street Bridge. We're seeking a variance to flare produced gas while we are testing this pipeline. And I will repeat, we're testing the pipeline for its integrity. As noted in the petition, this pipeline was put in service in the 1980s. It's been used by several other companies, and we took possession of it. Actually, we're the lessee of it in 2006. We really do not know a lot about this pipeline. The only information we've discovered about this pipeline is some of the original drawings that showed the route of the pipeline and its size. To that extent, we know nothing else about this pipeline. And the variance is to allow us to flare while we're going through the testing. Essentially, what the testing will include first purging the gas from the line. We will be purging with a nitrogen gas and sending the residual gas, the pipeline, to our CO2 plant in outside of Fillmore. And you're sure you're familiar with that from our last petition when we talked about that. Once the nitrogen slug has past a certain point where we are going to build a temporary pig receiving facility. The gas will be separated. Part of the nitrogen and the natural gas will go to the plant, and then the pipeline will be opened and nitrogen will be vented from the pipeline. Then I'm not sure of all the details. I'm more or less the environmental gentleman. I have Mr. Casey Shoemate, who's our mechanical integrity coordinator, who can get into the more specific discussions regarding the pigging operations. But it's my understanding that a cleaning pig will go through, a sponge, that will go through several times to make sure the pipeline is clean for the next instrument. Another instrument will go through to check to make sure that the twists and turns of the pipeline and exactly where they are. Then a device called a smart pig will be sent through the pipeline, and it's my understanding this smart pig has a number of different antenna on it that circle around the pipe as it goes, and we will basically get a snapshot of just about every inch of the pipeline and its integrity. And that is the basic reason why we're here tonight, is to allow ourselves to flare some of our gas production while we conduct this testing. Any questions, or would you like more information regarding the pigging itself?
It appears that somebody else wishes to address the board as well.
Oh, no,
Oh, okay.
I'm Casey Shoemate, the Mechanical Integrity Coordinator for Vintage, and as Jim mentioned, I'm the project coordinator on this job. So if you had any technical questions, I can help you answer those.
All right, thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to ask the board if they have any questions of the petitioners. Mr. Herlock.
Yeah, thank you. I have a number of questions. Do you have a copy of the draft order?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm going to refer my questions to various locations in that draft order. On page 2, in the background, it talks about at the second paragraph under background, at the Hamp lease, 5 natural gas-fired compressors were removed and gas lift production was eliminated. Could you explain that?
Mr. Herlock, I'll go back in history a little bit. I believe at the last variance hearing for our South Mountain Pipeline project, we said to the hearing board and to the district that those compressors will be taken out of...
Sorry, page 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. That those 5 natural gas compressors would be taken out of service and removed from the site. And basically what that did, those compressors were used for some artificial lift, pumping natural gas down the wellbore, down the casing to force oil back up the bore to increase production.
Does the elimination of those compressors, and I guess the gas lift production is what the compressors are used for, does that somehow increase the quantity of gas that you send to the pipeline?
Yes,
It seems to be in the
Yes,
context
it
that
does.
you're explaining why there's more, is or will be more gas.
That gas was burned to compress the gas to increase oil production, and when we shut those compressors down, that gas then moved into the pipeline for sales.
So that's one of the sources of additional gas in the pipeline, either now or in the future.
That's correct.
Continuing down to the next paragraph, I have a number of questions, and I'm guessing that other members of the board do as well. If you're the lessee of this pipeline, who's the owner?
I believe Termo Corporation is the owner. If you give me one moment, please, I'll ask a question of our operations manager in the office. Excuse me for a moment. Thank you for that break here. It is Termo Corporation.
And when you became lessee, somehow it says here that as lessee, Vintage is responsible for the maintenance and integrity of the line in the last sentence. I'm puzzled by why the lessee is responsible, and it seems as though you took over this lease without knowing much about that pipeline, which doesn't seem very prudent to me. Can you explain that?
I can start the explanation. Number one, it's the only gas pipeline that comes out of the area. There's a number of leases up there. As noticed in the petition, we have the Ojai facility, the Silver Thread facility, Hamp Ferndale, and Timber Canyon. I believe the Termo comes into that line also. We buy their gas. There are, I think, 2 or 3, I'm not quite sure, independents that also send their gas to that pipeline.
Is Termo the one that you said is the owner of it?
Yes, they're the owner of it, and we're the lessee.
And they're one of the ones you're going to shut off?
Yes, sir.
That didn't really answer my question about why Vintage leased this without knowing anything about it. It just doesn't seem like the kind of a thing a business would do.
I don't think that we've got the information personally to answer that question. Neither of us is experts in the contract agreement that the company entered into in 2006.
Okay. Continuing down, you're going to be doing testing. It sounds like you're going to clean it first and then test it. What are the possible results of that testing? Let's at least give us a best case and a worst case.
The test is going to consist of 2 separate tool runs. The first tool run is a geometry and caliper tool run that will measure the inside diameter and features of the pipe, indicating any out-of-round conditions such as dents. And then the second run is going to actually measure for any type of wall loss, whether it's caused by erosion, corrosion, something of that nature. It'll take about at least 3 days to get the initial information back, and then what we'll receive is a report that will really inch by inch tell us what the condition of the pipeline is from a metal loss standpoint or any kind of deformation to the pipeline. And that's what we're going to find out from the test.
What's the worst thing you could find?
Bill, the worst thing we could find is there'd be a series of dents from third-party damage, or the worst thing would be that there was severe metal loss from corrosion or erosion.
This is the pipeline that ruptured before was the subject of your...
This is not the pipeline.
This is not the line that was the subject of the other variants?
No.
In the last paragraph on page 3, you talk about notifying the third parties. And the way it's stated, it sounds like you're going to wait, that you haven't given them any clue as to this coming up, and you're going to notify them the day or so that it's about to happen. Is that accurate?
Excuse me, Mr. Herlock.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience, sir. Our contract with third-party people coming into the pipeline, we're required to give them 24 hours notice before the shut-in. We usually try to give them some more time than that, but Our contract is a 24-hour notice.
Is there some reason why, let's say, if this variance is granted, that you wouldn't tell them tomorrow so they can make preparations and we don't have a hearing about them having to flare gas?
If the variance is granted, we can notify them, today's Monday, we can notify them Tuesday and Wednesday and get to all the third parties.
That seems to me that if I were them in their position, that's what I would like to see. And you don't really have any idea what's going to happen to that third-party gas?
No, sir.
There's some questions on the rating of these flares. There isn't, as I read the draft order, it seems to me that we should have better information on the rating of these 4 flares that are in question. There's stated here that there's more than 1 million BTUs, and later it says something about, I think, 7 or 7.4, and I don't know if that's all of them or one of them, or if it's only one of them, what about the other 3? And
the reference at the bottom of page 3 to the 1 million British thermal units, that is the limit that the APCD will allow an emergency flare to go up to. So I think that's just a reference to the rule.
If you would, could you please speak a little bit louder?
I'm sorry.
It's a little bit
Mr.
hard,
Murphy, I appreciate it.
for my
All
hearing.
right.
Thank you.
I'll pick it up. Can you hear me now, Mr. Murphy? Okay. All right. I will try to speak louder then. And well, during the prior variance, we utilized these same flares, and I believe that the board gave us a limit of 2 million cubic feet per day. The 7 million million BTU, that is the rating of the flare, permitted flare at the HAMP lease. And I might add, all of these leases, with the exception of the Timber Canyon lease, are all on the same permit, 00004. Timber Canyon is on 00939, if I remember correctly.
okay. Has Vintage done any previous maintenance of this particular pipeline?
There's ongoing maintenance. If we have encroachment from, on the pipeline from a third party, we'll inspect the line when it's visible, and so to survey to make sure that it's not impacted. We've got some external monitoring on the line, and we do, where the line's visible and above ground, we have done some inspection on it.
Moving over to page 8, is the table of these the pollutants in pounds per hour and tons per day, was that calculation done by Vintage, or did the board or the district do that?
Calculation was done by Vintage.
Using factors from the board database?
Yes,
District
using
database?
factors from the APCD.
Can you describe a little bit further down this page your curtailment activities? I think I understand generally the curtailment, but why is the amount of oil production and the corresponding gas production, why did you choose that number? It looks like it's about 1/10 of your total production.
For the curtailment?
The 58 barrels per,
Oh, that, I have to, due to my ignorance, I have to make a correction there. That is 58 barrels, BOE, barrels of oil equivalent. It's,
I don't know what that means.
A barrel of oil equivalent, it turns natural gas, it equivalates a standard, 1,000 standard cubic feet of gas to a barrel of oil. So there's 6,000 standard cubic feet of gas in 1 barrel of oil in a BTU basis. So if we shut in 6,000 cubic feet of gas, that's the same as 1 barrel of oil.
I'm either not understanding or maybe my question isn't clear. It appears that you're flaring produced gas, and that's costing you $9,000 a day. And then there's 260 MCF per day of curtailed gas production and 58.25 barrels of either oil or oil equivalent of curtailed oil production. And my question is, are you curtailing the oil production in any of these fields?
Yes, some. There is some associated oil production that's going to be curtailed when we curtail some of the gas production.
Is that the 58 barrels of oil equivalent? I thought that you were reducing the oil that your fields are putting out by about 58 barrels per day.
I think what Jim's explaining with the way the math works out, it's not 58 barrels of oil. I think it's about 16 barrels of oil. And then the 260 MCF of gas, when you do the calculation on that, that works out to 58 BOE.
yes, Mr. Herlock, that was my mistake putting the figures together.
Okay. What, can you, I can't tell whether you're really curtailing oil production to curtail oil production or whether it's just happening as a result of something else. Because we need to make a finding that you are attempting to curtail emissions.
We're curtailing 260 MCF of gas production, flaring the other volume, and going to curtail 16 barrels of oil production. We lose all the gas production from an economic standpoint when we go to flare.
I think I don't have any further questions at the moment.
All right, thank you, Mr. Herlock. Mr. Stubblefield?
May I ask the district a question, or I can wait?
I think it probably would be best to wait unless it's pertinent to something specifically the petitioner just stated.
It is.
Okay, then I think that's fine.
It sounds as if, I didn't think about this when I reviewed this case over the weekend, but it sounds as if they're going to, that shutting in these pipe, curtailing production of oil and flaring this gas is going to result in the flaring of other petroleum products, natural gas, I assume, because this is a shared pipe. So this is not the whole picture of the impact.
That's correct. The way we view this situation is that the other producers that are being shut out of the pipeline, they're actually being shut out on what we would consider to be an emergency basis because they have absolutely no control over what's occurring here. So they would be entitled to flare under our emergency flaring provisions in flares less than 1 million BTUs per hour. my recollection is that most of the other producers that are up in that area are fairly small producers and would meet that criteria.
So I need some guidance here to make a finding that's favorable to this petitioner. We should disregard the emissions caused by, I mean, is it a lot? Is it a little? We don't know.
We don't know. You
don't know
Right
either.
now, we don't know.
And yet,
It-
the
it's-
district is recommending that the board grant this petition.
Yes, we are.
Well, when will we know? When will you know? When the other guys are
we-
informed
we-
and then do their own calculations?
I think we would have to work with Vintage to find out who the other third-party producers are and how much those third-party producers are selling into their pipeline.
I mean, so it could be insignificant, relatively speaking, but it could also be quite significant.
It could be relatively small. I don't think it would be anywhere near the size of the amount that Vintage produces and puts into the pipeline. I think Vintage is the largest gas producer up in that area, so I think all, combined of all the others, there'd be less than what Vintage is.
Okay, thank you.
As a follow to that, could the petitioner answer that question? Do you have any data or information now on these third party?
Needless to say, the petition itself, the numbers in the petition itself were based on production that day, but the numbers that I have here are from production today. Termo, about 810 MCF. It varies between 810 and 1,000. Smaller producers would be, I know that, I believe it's Murata Petroleum has a small tank setting in between ours, and they do have a flare. The other small producers I'm not familiar with, Mr. Stubblefield.
Well, in the years that I've been on the hearing board, I've never been confronted with a situation like this, but just as a courtesy, wouldn't Vintage want to bring some representatives from this third party, however small it might be, and so we could hear whether they endorse or oppose this move? I mean, obviously, they're going to have to make some kind of they're going to take a hit here, right? I mean, they're going to have to do something. And it sounds as if I understood you correctly, their only option is just simply to flare. They don't really have any other options, is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
And they don't yet know about this? They don't know that you're going to shut the pipeline down on February 21st? You haven't discussed it with them?
We have not discussed with them as of yet. Our contract with third party is 24 hours notice.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
As a follow-on, and then I'll give it to Mr. Herlock. Has Vintage, though you've not been the leasee for very long, is there any record of notification in prior situations where the third-party leasees were identified or notified of any potential shutdown due to operations or maintenance?
Other than the 24-hour required notice, I cannot recollect.
Okay,
Does that
so
answer
then the
your
question question more specifically is, have you notified these individuals in the past within the contracted 24-hour period?
Excuse me for a moment. The answer is yes, sir.
Would you care to elaborate on that, please? And if your operational representatives need to speak, then they need to be sworn in.
I'm going to have to ask one of the operational representatives to be sworn in because I am not familiar with the contractual obligations for the pipeline, Mr. Gasparino.
I guess this is the question I have as the board. Is this okay with me questioning and asking this? Okay. All right. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Gasparino.
Yeah. And if you state your name and position with the company for the record, please.
Yes, sir. My name's William Sweeney. I'm the team operations lead for South Operations. And the answers to your question are yes and yes. In times past, when our agreement with these third-party vendors, as Jim has said, it's a contractual obligation from a notification standpoint when we know of an upset or pending maintenance that affects them, to notify them of such. At a minimum, the contract suggests that we have to do so within 24 hours. We operate the gas plant. When we knowingly are going to have maintenance, scheduled maintenance, and other things that would impact them, we give them as much lead time as we can. Sometimes that's 2 to 3 months of notification of a pending turnaround, shutdown, or such. The minimum is the 24 hours, as it suggests per contract. But yes, we do. This case has not been brought to their attention as of yet, to my knowledge, because of the fact it's still pending as to whether we're going to be shutting in and curtailing. On the answer about what can they do to curtail, that is outside of our hands. They do have a choice. It can be to flare, and they may be able to shut in. I can't speak of the ramifications to the detriment of shutting something in that doesn't belong to us, but that is their choices. Does that help?
Okay. Mr. Sweeney, it should be noted for the record that you were the individual that signed as a petitioner representative. So
Yes,
thank you
sir.
for stepping up. Any questions of the petitioner or Mr. Sweeney at this point?
And going back, Mr. Stubblefield, to your question, we, in the volume of gas going through that line, we as the lessee and going to our gas plant, we're aware of the volume of that gas that goes through there. It's approximately 3.4 million, for which we represent the 66 or greater in just rough numbers. So the third parties that we're impacting would be about 1/3. And in rough numbers, it's 1 million standard cubic feet of gas a day. And as Jim alluded to, that is divided amongst various independent operators and contractors. The biggest one of which we know through independent measurement is Termo. Termo is approximately 800 MCF of gas on a per day basis. Again, speaking on Termo, how much of that they will have to go to flare under an emergency variance, or how much of it they would be able to shut in, I have no way of differentiating, knowing that.
Mr. Murphy?
As far as you know, this is the first time this pipeline has ever been tested?
That's correct.
Okay. Is there any standard time period for which pipelines like this should be tested? You get oil every 3,000, 5,000 miles. Is there a standard for your pipelines?
The regulations have changed significantly in the last 5 to 7 years. This line was installed in 1980. At this point in time, this line doesn't have a required inspection frequency based on the nature of the line the gas that's going through it, some of the other features. It's our position that we should do this test because it'll give us information that'll tell us about the integrity of the line. And that's important information that we can use to better manage the maintenance going forward.
You've had the line for 5 years now. Is there any reason why you're doing it at this time as opposed to shortly after you acquired it?
As our company's grown, we've looked at our pipeline system throughout California and prioritized our lines based on what we feel is that the next segment of lines that we should test and inspect. This line, based on that prioritization, we felt like 2011 was a good time to do an inspection on this line.
If you don't clean and the line at this time, let's say you just would never do this, then eventually the result would be you'd have a blowout or something. What's the real reason for you wanting to do this?
I mean, that's a risk, certainly, but the failure mechanism could vary between a small leak that would create a nuisance and something more than that. Any situation that would occur that was an unplanned leak would cause us to have to shut the line in and dig up the road to find the leak and do maintenance in an emergency situation. And we're trying to avoid that.
In this, as I understand this, within the highway right-of-way, are you going to have to dig up the road, or is this all going to be, except for potholing, done without digging up the roadway?
The test we're proposing will require us to dig up the road in one location to install some equipment. That's I think it's close to the railway right-of-way on 12th Street. So there's one fitting there that we need to excavate, pothole, and do some work there. The rest of the work will be outside the roadway.
Okay. My understanding from reading the report is that if you wouldn't flare, shut things off, that there's potential for actually excessive gas emissions that would result from shutting in that way. I would assume that risk would also apply to your third parties?
Our experience with our wells has indicated that that's what could happen. I can't speak to somebody else's operation.
Yeah. So yours it would. You can't
Ours it
speak
would.
for certain about any others. You wouldn't know that wouldn't be a possibility.
That's correct.
You've talked about 6 different leases here and 4 different flares. I would assume that some of these leases use common flares?
Yes, that is correct. The Ojai facility has 2 flares. The Silver Thread facility has 2 flares. The Hamp facility, which is right next to Silver Thread, has 1 permitted flare, the 7 million BTU flare, and there's an emergency flare at our Timber Canyon lease.
Okay, so the Ferndale has no, where does it?
The Ferndale is connected with the Hamp lease.
Okay, and both Clark and West leases have the same flare?
Yes, that would be the Timber Canyon facility.
Okay. I have no further questions of the petitioner. Excuse me, if I could.
Mr. Murphy, go ahead.
Yeah. With respect to the numbers that you were pointing out on page 8 and the barrels, there should be corrections in the order of that. For the order to be correct, that the page 8 should be corrected?
Yes, Mr. Murphy.
Okay. Is there anything else in this order that you've read that you think needs to be corrected?
I believe this right here.
Well, that's the same thing, though. So we need to correct that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Murphy. On page 8, where it discusses under number 4, the 58 barrels per day, under paragraph 3, second paragraph of that, where it states the approximately $15,000 a day, that number would change due to the fact that my error of thinking 58 barrels of oil was going to be down. That number would be reduced by 18, 16?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
That number would reduce from 58 down to 18 barrels. So that number would change. It would be 18 barrels times the $93 per barrel.
And of the pollutants, I think you've already stated that is solely for from your operations, and that would, so therefore the pollutants there that are in the schedule and at the top of the page 8 would not be all the pollutants that would result from your shutting down production of or shutting down the pipeline, simply because you've got third parties that necessarily would have to add to the pollution, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The numbers there just reflect our flaring.
Okay. I have no further questions of the petitioner.
Mr. Stubblefield, did you have a follow-on question?
Yes. Thank you. One of the findings was, I don't remember where I saw it, it said that the flares are all located in sparsely populated areas,
Yes, sir.
but is there anybody living within a mile of any of the flares?
To the best of my knowledge, at our Ojai facility, I believe the closest residence is, I'm trying to remember from the previous variance, I believe the closest resident in the Ojai area is half a mile.
These are the same flares.
Yes, these are the same flares that we discussed in the
I
previous.
vaguely recall someone a half mile.
And in the
Wasn't there a school?
Beg pardon?
Wasn't there a school in
There
fairly
was
close proximity to one of
the
them?
school was over a mile away, if I remember correctly. The Hamp flare, there are no residents within several miles. The same with the Timber Canyon flare, there's several miles. And for the Silver Thread flare, if I recollect correctly, there is one gentleman that lives, I think it's within if I remember correctly, within a quarter of a mile, but he is down slope, and I do not believe he'd be able to see the flares at Silver Thread. They are all encased with shrouds.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm reading from page 9 of the original petition, and under item G, which is on page 9, the distance to the nearest resident is .24 miles, and to the nearest school, .7 miles, as it relates to the nuisance that's specified in Rule 51. I have a few questions. I guess I'd like to ask the petitioner, and of course, some of the questions have been answered as a result of waiting to this period of time. Did you request the 30 days for the short variance, or was that the district's recommendation?
We requested the 30 days. There should be a schedule attached to your packet.
Okay, the reason I ask that is a short variance the duration can be as much as 90 days. And I was just wondering, are you going to have sufficient time during the short variance to do what you need to do, especially if you end up finding that, doing the excavation at this one point or doing some of the pig lining testing, et cetera? Do you have sufficient time in your schedule? I mean, I looked at it, but, we always want to make sure that you have a little bit of freeboard there. So.
Yeah, our schedule is around 18 days at this point, and
Okay.
so we think that 30's sufficient time to cover any contingency.
Okay, fine. I guess the next question I have is relating to the reduction, millions of cubic feet. And I guess really my question, if I go to back number 5 on page 9 of your short variance order 834, it says that you'd be able to curtail gas production by 260 MCF per day. I guess my question of you is, can you not do better than that in terms of the reduction?
The experience we've had before when we shut in gas and don't flare it is that we will see gas leak by through the formation. And as a result, trying to shut the gas in doesn't really have that effect. And so going to flare is the best answer because it's a controlled way to manage the gas. That's our experience in the past has been that shutting in the wells creates gas leak by.
Well, I'm not suggesting that you not do that, but I guess the question I really have is whether or not you can reduce that number more.
When looking at our production profile, the 260 MCF a day is gas that we feel we can shut in safely without causing any kind of undue impact.
And the impact would be what?
If we shut in some of the other wells, they'll pressure up and they can actually come to surface through natural seeps or some other means. That's what we've seen in the past.
Okay. During your prior variance, just a question, and maybe it's really for the district, is whether or not, well, I guess it is for the district, with respect to the nuisance issue. I think there was an individual that came and questioned about odor, so I'll wait for the district at that point in time. I have no further questions. Are there any other questions, Mr. Herlar?
I have a question that's really a follow-on to Mr. Gasparino's question about the curtailment. One of the findings we need to make is that you've given consideration to curtailing operations, and I'm not sure I'm hearing that. I don't know how you go about, reducing or curtailing gas production by the 260 MCF, but I'm not hearing anything about curtailing oil production. Is that not possible to somehow curtail oil production without shutting in wells?
That's correct. The only way to curtail oil production is to shut in the wells. But that doesn't, if we shut the oil production in, that doesn't change the gas. The gas is still going to come up the wellbore.
So the amount of oil and gas that comes out of a well you have no control over that? And I don't know much about oil wells, but
the gas pressure, because of the formation pressure, the gas tends to rise to the surface. The oil doesn't come up unless we help it. So if we turn the equipment off and stop the oil production, the gas will still try to surface. And we would, in a normal shutdown situation, if we lost electrical power to the properties and our pumping equipment stopped, our gas production would go to flare under emergency circumstances. And it would continue along that lines if we didn't have production or electricity to run our pumps.
If the pump failed and stopped pumping, is the amount of gas that comes out of that well unchanged?
I can't say for sure. I mean, I can't say yes or no, and that's a difficult question to answer.
But I'm hearing generally that it's not possible for Vintage to curtail oil production without shutting in wells and unknown effect on gas production.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I'll answer this in a couple of, with this, the particular volume of oil that we listed in this for curtailment is 260 MCF. Along with that 260 MCF, there is 16 barrels of oil directly associated with that 260 MCF. And that's where, in doing the math that they were explaining earlier, it equivalates out to a 58 barrels of oil equivalent a day. But yes, with this 260 MCF that we will be shutting in and curtailing, there is directly 16 barrels of oil associated with that. To continue deeper into the lease, shutting in additional wells, it brings forward the problems that Casey was mentioning, as well as the long-term possible wellbore damage to the wells in sand encroachment and some other downhole dynamics that we're not prepared at this time to risk unless that simply becomes the board's only objective to asking us to do so. Going back to your pipeline question earlier on the contracts, Casey will have to correct me, but I think the pipeline was initially constructed in 1980, and it had a working pressure of 1,800 pounds. When Vintage leased this line and we operated it, we only operated at 300 pounds. So we felt quite certain about the line at the time that we entered into the lease. And as I mentioned, we're the 66%. We're the greater stakeholder here in that line and ensuring that line has integrity and stays open. We also purchase Termo's gas, and there was some incentives for Termo as well as ourselves to where we become the lessee of the line. But we didn't do so just blindly. As I said, the line was built 1980 to an 1,800 pound working pressure for which we knowingly are operating at 300 pounds. So it was with some good forethought that we entered into that agreement.
Thank you. One final question. If the variance is granted, one of the conditions is that Vintage will record the daily volume of gas combusted in the emergency flares. Are all the 4 flares, the 1 permitted and 3 unpermitted, that you're proposing to use, equipped with the metering and logging capabilities to do that?
Excuse me, Mr. Herlock.
I'm sorry. The question was, can we meter? Can we meter?
Yes, sir, they can all be metered.
Okay. Do you have a way of knowing that they're burning?
Yes, sir. There's an operator. Actually, there's 2 operators, or up to 3 operators that go by these flares and the oil fields daily. One of our employees lives where he can almost stare at the Ojai flares. I won't offer up him being up all night to look at the flares, but he can notice if the flare is burning or not.
Is there some automatic way for the flare not to go out?
Typically, they are equipped with an auto igniter that sends a spark. It's kind of like a spark plug that sparks every few seconds that will reignite the flame if it goes out.
Does that apply to these 4?
I can't say for certain, but we could check with the operations guys if you'd like that answer.
Okay, thank you.
No other questions of the board at this time?
The petitioner.
Of the petitioner, right, by the board. Okay. At this point, then, I'd like to ask the district to state their position on the granting of the variance and/or their comments regarding the petition.
Well, in our letter to your board, we did recommend that the variance be granted, and I do understand that there's concern about the third-party producers being shut out of the pipeline and having to flare their gas also. We made our decision to recommend the variance be granted primarily on a safety issue, and we didn't want to be put in the position of standing in the way of granting a variance when there might be a safety issue related to the pipeline. And that was one of our main thought processes that went into this. And we are concerned about the amount of flaring that will occur under this variance, both by Vintage and the third-party producers. The area where the other third-party producers are located are fairly remotely located away from residences, but I won't say that there are no residences by the other third parties, but my recollection of that area is that there's few and far between. The three flaring sites that Vintage will be flaring from are located in three different areas. I think I noted in our letter that there's a spacing of about 1.6 miles between one set of flares and the Hamp Silver Thread area, and then about 2.6 miles east to the Timber Canyon flares. So it's not going to occur all in one area. We also did take into consideration the past variances that Vintage was granted, which allowed them to flare somewhat of a similar amount of gas. And I made note both in the variance order and the draft order under the nuisance section, and I believe in our letter to your board, during that variance period, we did receive one complaint from a residence nearby the Ojai flares, and we had an inspector. Shortly after the people called in, we had an inspector return the call, talk to the complainant, went out, met with Mr. Levins, and I think some of the field staff out at the flare used one of our analyzers and couldn't detect any elevated levels of hydrocarbons with our analyzer or just by smell. There just wasn't any visible odors, no odd odors that we could sense. The inspector did note that there's a fairly large oil seep, and that area in the upper Ojai does have a number of oil seeps, and the oil seep is somewhat close to the residence, so we're not sure if it was the oil seep, the flare, or some other project that might have been happening up in that area that might have concerned that resident. But we felt that with the long-term flaring that occurred at that point, and just having that one complaint call that we couldn't verify, kind of leads us to believe that there won't be a nuisance that would be related to the proposed flaring that you're hearing about tonight. I would like to clarify something about the relationship of residences and the school to the flares. From the previous hearings, Vintage provided I'm not sure if they provided to your board, but they provided to us, the district, several maps. The Ojai fee lease, they show from the flare to the nearest residence is about a quarter mile. from the flare to the school that's on the Ojai Santa Paula Road is about 7/10 of a mile. And then from the Silver Thread flare has a residence that's, looks like two residences that are about 0.2 miles from the flare. Another residence is about 0.3 miles from the flare. Looking at the maps, those are about the only residences that are within maybe at least half a mile from that flare. And then the Timber Canyon flare, my understanding, is quite a ways away from any residence. That was kind of the thought process that we put into our recommendations on allowing flaring to occur. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Anybody on the board have questions of the district staff at this time? Mr. Stubblefield.
I don't know if I should address this question to the district or the petitioner, but if everything's okay with the pipeline, it'll be 30 days or less. But if it's not, would repairs commence immediately, or would they be scheduled sometime in the future, or what? Because it's, right now it's not a real bad time to do this, but of course, as we all know, as we approach summer, it becomes worse and worse. It's a less opportune time to do this. It's kind of late in the winter already. So that's my question.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions to the Vintage personnel, and I think it's more appropriate for them to answer that.
We'll get an initial report after 4 to 5 days. That'll just be kind of a screening. It'll be 30 to 45 days before we get a complete report back from the inspection company, and then we will have to review the findings, and based on what we find, we'll have to decide what we're going to do. There's no way to really forecast what that could be. There probably will be some things we need to pothole and inspect further, and that's probably the next step. But beyond that, I really can't say, with any certainty what we're going to run into.
So there's no plan to really make any repairs during this, for the duration of this initial
During the
permit?
during the 30 days, if we were to find something of a minor nature that we could repair easily, we've got 200 feet of pipeline, pre-tested pipeline on racks that we could install, and that could be in a 200-foot section or various smaller sections. So we're prepared to do that much work within the 30 days if we need to. But beyond that, we would consider that to be, major work that we wouldn't get into during the 30 days.
And how long did it take to make the repairs for the other pipe that was damaged? 3 months?
Yeah, but that was to replace the entire line. We ran a complete new line.
Right.
Yeah. It's two different pipelines.
It's unlikely this would
I think it's unlikely.
be of that magnitude.
I think it's unlikely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Hurlock?
I have some questions for the district, if you. It bothers me a fair amount that the district is taking the position that because these third parties may or may not be notified, they have no control over this, and that this is an emergency, and that their flaring can be done on an emergency basis. It may be that Vintage has or will tell them. Sounds like they haven't yet, but they might. And it seems that all of us taken together do have the ability to let these other people know and to figure out a way that their flaring is not on an emergency basis. I don't know whether an emergency basis means that there's going to be some emergency variance requests, but burning on emergency variance, 1,000, basically 1 million cubic feet per day, doesn't seem like, when we all know about it ahead of time, doesn't seem to me like a very good thing to be doing. And I'm wondering if it would be possible to defer this issue until we come up with a way to avoid that situation. I'm not sure what that might be, but I just don't like the idea of, it seems like it's a bit of a stretch to call this situation an emergency for 1 million cubic feet a day. When we all know it's coming, except possibly these third parties. Does the board, the district comment on that?
Yeah, I tend to agree. Our experience with the smaller producers is that the amount of gas that they're producing, I don't have any personal knowledge of the small producers feeding into the other third-party producers feeding into the Vintage pipeline. But we do see that the smaller producers are capable of flaring gas and being under 1 million BTUs per hour heat input to that flare, and thus not requiring permits from us for those flares. So their flaring activity isn't regulated if they're under 1 million BTUs per hour. The one question I have might be the thermo operation.
Well, the numbers are in the draft order to get to something awfully close to 1 million cubic feet a day.
I've been trying to do the math in my head, but my head doesn't work that well.
Well,
these days. To go down to 24 hours and then BTUs.
Oh, BTU. Are you saying that anybody in the county could flare anything under 1 million BTUs per hour, and the district wouldn't regulate that?
It's not required to have a permit. It's not subject to our any of our rules and regulations, except that it can't have excess visible emissions. It can't cause a nuisance.
Right.
That's the same threshold level that we exempt small boilers, process heaters, and things like that. Some of the oil producers have maybe process heaters that are less than 1 million BTUs per hour, but they're unregulated. They're exempt from permit.
Mr. Murphy?
Yes. If I've got questions for the district, but if I could have a preliminary question to the petitioner. If we delayed granting this petition for 3 weeks, would that cost you, you've got a schedule now that you've laid out, would that be detrimental to you in any way and cost you very much money for that 3-week delay?
I don't know what it's going to cost. I've got the work scheduled, but I didn't. I've got to get the approval of the board before we can do the work. So, we've got crews that are mobilized in Texas, actually waiting to hear.
The reason I'm asking is we've got another hearing scheduled for the 27th, and I am particularly uncomfortable when you've got 1/3 of the gas that's going through this pipe is by third parties, one of whom is up to 1,000 NCF a day, and we really don't have before us the data with respect to residences or anything like that. I'm just very uncomfortable, and I think that we should have all the results of what the pollution consults of petitioner's action before us before we make a decision, and we do not. That's the problem I have with that. But rather than make a speech, let me go on and ask.
May I ask for clarification on your question of the petitioner? The answer you gave, sir, it sounds to me like a notice to proceed has not taken place, correct? It's your own company that is just waiting for the action on work?
I've got a third-party contractor that is scheduled to do the work commencing on the 21st, but I won't start the work without the variance.
Okay, all right,
So
thank you very much.
that's the status.
All right, thanks.
And I hate to take up people's time here because it's not going to affect whether, my next few questions of the board isn't going to affect whether you get the variance or not in any way, shape, or form. It just has to do with me trying to get educated by the board with respect to this. And this is of what you consider the violations, because sometimes I've kind of had these before, questions like this, and I've kind of let it slide. But like in this, we say there is we've got violations of Rule 29. We've got violation of Rule 71.1, and I have no problem. I know there is a violation of Rule 29 because they are working outside of what is directed by their permit. But on Rule 71, when you quote that, it says, pursuant to Rule I'm reading from page 4 here of the variance order. All tanks shall be equipped with a properly installed, maintained, and operated vapor recovery system. These tanks are. The vapor disposal portion of the vapor recovery system shall consist of either a system which yada, yada, yada. I don't see that they have that too. I don't see that there's a violation of that. There's a how is it a violation of that? It is a violation of their permit that that they can't, under 29, that the conditions there are very clearly violated. That they're using their flares other than for emergency standby under their permit. They can't. Therefore, there's a violation. Why do you stick in the 71.1?
Well, we feel that in order to be, we feel that the flares aren't technically a part of their approved vapor recovery system.
No, I agree with that, but that doesn't mean it violates 71.1.
Well, I think we are reading 71.1 is that the vapor recovery system that it alludes to has to be a permitted type system, you might say. And these flares being categorized as emergency or not on the permit because they're considered emergency, don't constitute a part of their vapor recovery system. The Rule 71 requires that the system be controlled, with properly operated and maintained vapor recovery system. We just felt that it didn't meet that criteria.
Okay, well, you and I then, we have a difference on how we interpret that, and maybe Robert can look at that and get with me, and between the three of us, see if we can come to one mind on that in the future. As I say, it's more for my education. On permitted and unpermitted, they've got one permitted flare of the 7.25, and the others are all unpermitted flares, and all of the private owners have unpermitted flares. Are all flares need to be permitted, and this just hasn't come to your attention, or is there, do you have to have over that criteria of the million in order for you to require permitting?
When a flare has a rated input capacity of over 1 million BTUs per hour, then it requires a permit to operate from us.
And below that, it doesn't?
Below that, it's exempt from permit. That's
Okay,
correct.
I thought that in the conditions that you required them to come back, that's why it was confusing me, that you required them to come to you to get permits. Yeah, number 4, increments of process. No later than February 28th shall submit applications to modify the federal permit and the district permit to add all unpermitted emergency flares to their respective permits.
Right.
Therefore, that's why I didn't understand.
That's correct. The reason we're doing that in this case is because they're now using those flares for planned maintenance activity. It's no longer an emergency situation. So therefore, we feel that they've triggered the requirement to put those flares on permit. And I think we'll find that all 3 of the unpermitted flares are way over 1 million BTUs per hour. So we feel just by now falling into this, using these flares for this planned maintenance activity, they've lost that emergency exemption.
Okay, if you're going to have then flares that are permitted to do maintenance, can you then have a limit for maintenance so that they can do maintenance, and such in this case without having to come to the board?
Yes, and that's been our practice, is we allow an unlimited amount of flaring for emergencies, but we do put a level of natural gas that can be used for maintenance type activities.
Okay, so they'll come to you for the getting these permitted, and in that you will then add levels where they can utilize those for maintenance without having to come to this board.
That's
that will
correct.
be above the emergency limit.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Stubblefield?
Could the district help me understand I'm uncomfortable with the fact that 1/3 of the gas that's being used by this third party, of the gas that's going through the pipeline is that of this third party, correct? And yet there, okay, more than one. And yet that will be treated as an emergency flare. That seems inconsistent to me. I mean, I understand it must the way the rules are written, but it's all one pipeline. And the effect, I think we have to consider the cumulative effect of all the flares, not just the ones that the permitted flares that are that the petitioner is presenting us with, those 4 flares, because there are going to be others, and yet we don't really have a handle on, at this point, on what those emissions are going to be.
Yeah, that's correct. And that was our failure. We should have addressed that and done a calculation for what those what those other third-party flaring levels should have been. We should have tried to explain our feeling or our basis on those third-party producers being considered to be emergency, having to flare under an emergency. And we kind of make the line at whether they have control over the situation or not.
I mean, what I'm kind of hearing subliminally here is that they don't, they haven't been notified either by the petitioner nor by the district yet about what's going on, and they don't have to know until 24 hours prior to the action, because that's the way the rules are written, but that seems patently unfair to me.
If I could state something here, I know certainly the petition has to go out to the public for notification, but, that doesn't mean that the third parties were paying attention as to what's going on here this evening. If I could, I'd like to just read the criteria for a variance, finding number 3. Such taking would be without a corresponding benefit in reducing pollution. You've got to look at the contaminants or levels and the length of the variance. Evaluate the nature and the quantity of the emission, the benefit to the public of the immediate compliance, how many people are affected, what is the nature of the neighborhood, what is the baseline air quality, what are the health benefits of the compliance, and so on and so forth. And I'm sensing, if I can say this, that it certainly, the sense is that this feeling of the board, and I'm hearing also from the district, that both the district and the petitioner need to acquire some additional information, specifically information from the third-party contributors in this case, and that's very important before this board can make a decision on a short variance. And therefore, my sense is that we need to move for a continuance. But that's just my sense of what I've been hearing here for about the last hour and a half.
Mr. Gasparino, can I add one more thing?
Mr. Stubblefield.
And on number 3 as well, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that some of the numbers that are before me are not correct. And by the petitioner's own admission, there were some miscalculations there, but I don't think that this is the venue at which we should be recalculating. And it makes me, it hurts my confidence level that these numbers are verified ahead of time, were verified. So I'm uncomfortable with that as well.
Does the board have any other questions of either the district or the petitioner? Okay, I'd like to ask at this time, is there public comment? Okay, I guess I could move that the hearing is closed for final discussion by the board. And again, I refer back to maybe my earlier comment about continuance in this matter. So what's the wish of the board?
I move that we continue this until February 27th. If there, 28th, if there is some reason that the petitioner has that it really puts them in a bind, they could notify the district and we could see if we might move that up. But right now we have one scheduled for the 28th. So that would give us the district and the petitioner time to get the data from the third parties before us for us to make this decision.
Okay, I have a motion by Mr. Murphy. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion?
We can handle this motion without moving on the petition itself?
Yes, we're going to
Okay.
continue this to the next hearing meeting, which is on the 28th, and I guess I'll ask for legal counsel on this.
The only thing you should do, since you're continuing and not having it re-noticed or reheard, is give specific directions to staff as to what to bring back to you at that time. But it will just be a continuation of this hearing, which will remain open for further deliberations and reopening of testimony at that time.
Okay, so in terms of my not so eloquent summary about 5 minutes ago, the sense of the board is, number one, we don't have, all the numbers are not accurate and calculated correctly, number one. Number two, the information from the third party contributors to actually this particular variance, that information has not been provided, and both the district and the petitioner are both being asked to provide the specific data in terms of volumes back to this board for the hearing. Was there anything else that is being asked of the board before?
Mr. Gasparino?
Yes, Mr. Furlong.
I would suggest that getting that information is probably not the petitioner's job, the district's job, but the district may have to ask the petitioner for.
Yeah, I'm just, I don't know the responsibilities between each parties. I'm just saying that's the information that needs to be brought back to us.
Yeah, well, we need to know what's going to happen with that other million cubic feet a day.
Okay. So is it clear what the district is being asked?
Yes, we're clear.
Okay, and the petitioner as well?
I believe so. May I clarify, please, Mr. Gasparino?
Yes.
Number one is correct. The figures in paragraph 3, where the costs and the difference between barrels of oil and BOE and third-party contribution.
Correct, and then I think not only on the page 3, but I think there was an additional page later on that had tabulated information that related to the 58 barrels and the $15,000, number 5, yeah, on page 9, so.
Excuse me, Mr. Stubblefield, number 5 on page 9?
Yeah, item 5, which I referred to earlier. Anything else on behalf of the board before we vote on this?
I have a number of little, what I'll call typos, but I think I can communicate them to the district
Okay, that'd be fine.
separately.
Okay, at this point, I'd like the clerk to pull the board.
Stephen Hurlock,
Aye.
Mike Stubblefield,
Aye.
Dan Murphy,
Aye.
Gary Gasparino.
Aye. Okay.
Thank you, board
very
members.
Thank you.
And again, on just a reminder for the district to put on the election for the new chair. Thank you very much. And the meeting is adjourned at, yeah, to the 28th. I should have said